Have you ever thought about where did these names come from for these streets in Fort Collins? You're going to see names like Cherry and Olive, and you're going to see names like Grant and Jefferson. My name is Wayne Sundberg, and tonight we're going to be talking about how the different streets got their names from Mr. Avery back in the 1870s. So sit back and enjoy our program, which we are calling Pioneers, Presidents, and Trees. Some of you may recognize this town, I hope. Remember, one of my history professors in college always said, if you're going to teach history, you need to start with the present and go backwards. And I always thought, you know, there's something to be said for that. This is a map that was done about 1920 as the town was beginning to grow, and it shows the streetcar line and everything on it. And the one feature that people comment on when they come to Fort Collins is they say, you know, your downtown is kind of off kilter. You have part of it that's off at an angle. And say, yes, that's called Old Town. And across Mountain to the south and across College to the west is New Town. Now the realtors say that Old Town goes from west of Shields to about Riverside to the river and then clear down to Prospect, because it's not, you know, it makes a nice selling tool. I have a wonderful house over on Magnolia Street, and you don't want to have an ad that says in the old part of town. So they extended the term Old Town. But Old Town technically is just the triangle. So you're looking basically to the west. Does anybody know the name of that lake? Most people refer to it as City Park Lake, but it's Sheldon. It was actually dug in 1874. It was going to be part of a big sheep ranch. So here again is that triangle part. Part of that, or the reason for that, is because the fort was located right in here. Here's the mill race. One of the proposals for some of the upgrades is to put in on Willow Street a water feature that would kind of mimic the mill race. It's just in a real conceptual stage. So. But anyway, it was the water that powered the mill wheel here in the mill at Lincoln and Willow. Now this was a postcard I picked up several years ago, and I thought it was interesting because the message says the streets are very wide and irregular. They were surveyed according to the original camp streets while the place was a fort. So that's this person here, and this, I think the postmark on this is like 1909, and you know, here's Linden, here's College, Mountain. So they were, even back then, people knew what the reason for that oddly shaped part of the city was. And this is the original survey of the fort. This is a plat map that was done, we're pretty sure, by Casper Collins, who was the son of our namesake, William O. Collins. And it was done in 1864, probably in September. And it shows some buildings built and some not built. And the not built ones never got built. And so that was the layout of the fort. This is kind of flipping it over with the river down here. And then these irregular streets were already established, but what became Linden Street would have gone right through there. So that determined the shape of the Old Town, and that's, you know, why we prize the Old Town, and you know, people, I guess, like to use the name and so on. The fort was here from, it was ordered on August 20th, 1864, so that's our birth date. Yeah, it was a Civil War fort, yes, and then abandoned finally, or completely, in March of 1867. So 2.5 years, and that's our namesake, Lieutenant Colonel William O. Collins from Ohio. And then here again is that, you know, looking again into that. When I put this slide in and was looking at these, and I sat there and I thought, I don't know, I think I've got this flipped over, because this looks like College, but that's actually Linden. Here's the Avery block, here's the Linden Hotel. Here's the Pooter feed, or feeder supply. The people that came over here to start the town organized a town company called the Larimer County Land Improvement Company. And their purpose was to acquire land and to lay out a town and then sell the lots. Over here, the type of instrument is a town plat. And so they deeded the town plat to the town of Fort Collins. Down at the bottom is the date, January 16th, 1873. So that's kind of officially our founding for the town. And the land from the military reservation wasn't opened up until March of 1872. And so that's when they started organizing. Some of them had come from Greeley. They were disgusted with Greeley and came over here and wanted to start their own town with some little different policies than what Greeley had. General Robert Cameron was the president of this town company. So they're the ones that hired Avery to do the second plat of the town. So he was then happy he could use east-west, north-south lines. And this is Mr. Avery. The time he laid out the town, he was just in his early 20s. He had come to Greeley in 1870 at age 21, but had been trained as a surveyor and was actually raised on a farm in upstate New York. I think he was kind of a forward-looking person. And his first job was to help lay out the town of Greeley. And if you could read on this, the streets that are running this way are named things like Cherry and Oak and Olive and Mulberry and so on. And then the streets that run north and south had the people names. So he got to practice on Greeley. And one time I gave a program in Greeley and I said, so we can say, you know, Greeley was the rough draft for Fort Collins. I don't think I've been asked back to talk in Greeley since then. So. And then here's the old town part of Avery's plat when he came over here and laid it out. And you can see the river at that time had 3 islands in it, as it did when the fort was here. And then sometime in the 30s or 40s, it was mechanically rechanneled to be straight. And this is the horseshoe you read about in the paper where they're talking about putting in the open amphitheater down there, the entertainment venue in the horseshoe. The river today goes right across here.
The oxbow.
Yeah, cut off the oxbow. And I was told that J.O. Anderson did that sometime in the late 50s, early 60s with a bulldozer. And I don't know if I'd like to find that for sure sometime. So when Avery laid out the town then, he had to contend with some of the established streets down here, like Jefferson, which on the original Fort Platte was called the Denver Road, which was the Overland Trail. And then another one he had to contend with was this street out here. And do you know what street that is? Canyon, yes. And Canyon goes the Spring Canyon Dam, the Spring Canyon that was dammed up by that dam is out here, and there was a stage station out here, a swing station. And so when the stages were coming up from Denver, they got out here, and instead of going on into LaPorte, they had to make a slight detour, come in this way. Here's Pine Street, goes right into the fort, drop off the mail, and then proceed down the river. And there was a Pooter Street at one time back over in here that went off at an angle too. And that was the road then that took them along the river out to LaPorte. So he had to contend with those things. He also had to contend with the Agricultural College. It was established here in 1870. And so when he laid out the town, the college was already here. And so on the plat map, you do have the Agricultural College of Colorado. Well, the college was established in 1870 by the territorial legislature after Mason and Patterson and some others donated land. The first real building, Old Main, wasn't built until 1879. So here's a little later map. This is actually 1894 or 95, I guess it is. The thing I like about this map is it shows the Old Town Triangle very distinctly, but it also has on it has labels on a lot of these buildings. So it tells you who owned the buildings or what kind of business they were. And the one that I found most interesting was this little house right there. And alongside of that, it said Mother Stone. So apparently that's where Auntie Stone was living when she died, because she died the next year. Between Linden and Lincoln. Or I'm sorry, Linden and Chestnut in those days. And then down here you have Courthouse Square. Avery laid out one block as the Courthouse Square. He also laid out 2 parks, Lincoln, and we're a little bit off the map, but over here where the old City Hall is Washington Park. And unfortunately, several years ago, the City Council, in their infinite wisdom, changed this to Library Park, totally ignoring the fact that it was the library and the museum in that park. So but it is actually Lincoln and Washington. So, but Courthouse Square, then in 1887, they built a courthouse on it. And then we've had a series of courthouses that have replaced it over time. The other thing that Avery did with his plat is he put in a connecting walkway. Here's Linden, Walnut, right here, called Trimble Court. And that's, one time I called that an alley and got chewed out by Martha Trimble, who jumped up in the back of the crowd and said, "Wayne, you know that's not an alley. That was a walkway. That was named for my grandfather." Yes, Martha, I knew that. I'm sorry. Another thing that was that they put in was, here's a roundabout. This is LaPorte, College, LaPorte, Pine, Walnut. But that's where the community Christmas tree used to be. But here's Avery's wide streets. And somebody asked him one time, at least quoted in Watrous, in his 1911 history, he said, somebody asked Mr. Avery, why the wide streets? And Avery said, well, we were way out west and there was lots of room and people wanted wide streets, so I gave them to them. And I can't imagine him saying that. His more practical reason, according to my idea, is that the wide streets, you could turn a fully loaded freight wagon around without having to back it up. That's just I don't know that for a fact, but this is what I think, and then a few years later, people are quoting it back to you as fact. So. But this is looking north, the 100 block of North College, and the old agricultural hotel that was replaced by the Northern. Here's Mr. Trimble's block, right at the opening of Trimble Court. And I always try to think of, why is that guy, he's coming pretty hard there, throwing up a lot of dust. So he's either very, very thirsty, because the town was not yet dry, or maybe he's being chased by an irate husband. I don't, You can make up your own story, This picture is 1881. If you had the wider picture, the Opera House was just being finished over here. When they laid out the town, then there was people got to choose, or buy their lots, and they kind of had like a drawing, like a lottery kind of thing. And Jay Boughton drew one of the lots, and he managed to put up the first building on College Avenue, right where the Opera Gallery is today. And it was just a false front, two-story building. And his brother Clark had his newspaper in there called the Fort Collins Standard. And if you really use your imagination, it says Standard Office up there. So anyway, and then that was eventually moved around the corner onto Mountain, near the corner of Mason and Mountain. And then in the early 1900s, it was torn down when they built the Barclay Boughton Crane Hardware Building, which is still there now, on the northeast corner. And this is when this I think picture was taken in 1905, after it was well abandoned by then. And then if you went further out, big wide College Avenue, and you got out by the college, it was like they weren't quite sure where the street was. See, they kind of wander over here, and you can, But if this guy in his carriage was going this way right now, he'd have 3 lanes of traffic coming right straight at him. No, this is College Avenue, and where the little dip is in here, that's where Elizabeth comes out. And then the original building on campus, Old Main, that burned down in 1970. And then if you went further south on College, south of Harmony, you came to Fossil Creek Fruit Farm, or what was known as the McClellan Orchard, owned by J.S. McClellan and his family. And you can see now it just becomes just a country road. And that would have been the road on south after 1877 down to Loveland. So College just kind of, didn't become very much once you got quite a ways south. So here we are, nice wide College Avenue. And what can you do with a street that wide? Well, how about you invite all the automobiles in town for a picture? H.C. Bradley, who had a photography studio in the 100 block of South College, over on the east side in the building that's still known as the Bradley Block, he put this thing in the paper and said he wanted all the owners of automobiles in Fort Collins, this was in early 1907, to come down in front of his building, in front of his store on College Avenue, on a Saturday morning, and he was going to take the picture and he was going to submit it to a magazine called Motor Field. And so all the cars showed up, and I don't know if that's all of the cars. You know, I'm sure there's must be some missing. But he climbed up on the roof of the southbound streetcar. That's why he's up so close to the hanger arm. The power wire would have been on. I don't think they turned it off for him, so hopefully he didn't use that to steady himself. And this was like February, I think it was like February 25th, 1907, and he caught in his picture one of the earliest photographs that we can identify of the old interurban streetcar that started running the end of December 1907. And so here we are, almost, not quite 2 months later, the first picture. We tried to reproduce that picture in about 1980. Unfortunately, we picked a weekend where there was an antique car show somewhere else, and so these were all the cars we could get. So we had a lot of fun. We blocked off 2 blocks of College and all the side streets, and early in the morning, and a Sunday morning, yes. We legally did it. We got permission from the city. They brought down one of those kind of accordion lift things, and John Clark, the photographer, came down, and we lifted it up and took these cars, nothing like the original. But what we did in that car right there, that guy, his name is Alan Greenacre, and in that car right there, the guy in the cowboy hat, that's Jim Greenacre, his nephew. The gas stations came pretty quickly, and then some of the hardwares would sell things, and of course, later on you had Stanley steamers that used wood. And I'm not sure, where the very, very earliest cars got them. And there were electric cars. The electricity came in 1889. There was a doctor, and I can't think of his name now, I think it was Kickland, who had a house on West Mountain, and he had an electric car. He built a ramp, had a ramp built in the back of his house to go down the basement so he could drive his car down there at night and plug it in. And then, cars have more power backing up, and then he could back up the ramp the next day and go, drive around town. So, okay, also College Avenue wide enough to put streetcars down the middle and streetcar poles. This is about 1910, hand-colored postcard made from a photograph. And then here's the College Mountain Linden intersection, about 1905. And what's missing is there's no streetcar tracks. The other thing my wife said, be sure and point this out to you, is there is a stone walkway across the very wide street here from the west corner to the east corner of Mountain and College. What I read in the paper one time was that sometime in those early days, they had plank that was like a 12 by 2 plank. They had those laid across the street. And the ladies with their long dresses didn't like that because when it was muddy, their dresses would kind of drag in the mud. And so they decided that they were going to convince the men to put in these walkways. And so what the plot that they did was they stood like on the corner here, 2 or 3 of them. They'd pick a nice day when the streets were muddy. And as a man was crossing the street, when the man got about here, the ladies would then start crossing on that plank. And of course, gentlemen, what's the gentleman supposed to do? Step out of the way into the mud, tip your hat, good morning, ladies, and wait for the 3 ladies to go by. They said after a few times of that, people said, maybe we need something more permanent, a little bit wider. And so they said then they put in sandstone walkways across the streets. That may be pure fantasy, but it was in the early newspapers. And then here's about 5-6 years later, same intersection. Those ladies forget that there's a walkway over here. But here's the streetcars. And there actually was a double track system on Linden. And then you jump ahead to World War II, and you have now starting in 1918, the switch to the little Bernie cars, the little more efficient one-person operation cars. Every 20 minutes, they met down here at this intersection and made a 3-way switch. So very much a part of the culture of Fort Collins for just under a half century, because they quit running in 1951, the end of June. And as the town developed, you had lots of trees planted along College Avenue. It's hard to picture that that's what College Avenue would have looked like, and this would have been close to the downtown. I'm not sure which block this is, but I would guess probably maybe the 400 or 500 block, early 1900s. And then in the teens, they started paving the streets. That's when concrete paving came in. This is College Avenue and Mountain, and Avery's beautiful First National Bank building that was there for half a century. And here they are putting in the paving. According to the newspaper, when they paved the first block of College Avenue in the, it was like 1916, 1917, they closed off the street on a Saturday night, then it had a big dance and to celebrate the paving of the first block of College Avenue. And this is probably my favorite paving picture, because I would love to be able to animate that picture and move the streetcar, because you see what's going to happen as the streetcar comes this way? We have a nice face print, because he's looking the wrong way. Okay, and then here's by 1932. You can see that the town has grown some to the west and some to the south, but really not very much. Still a pretty small town. And notice, this is an official city map, City Park Lake. And then here's in the 50s. I think this photo was taken in 53 by the late J.D. Forney from his airplane. And this actually was taken with a stereopticon camera. This is the block that's at College and Mulberry, where, and then you're looking down toward Mountain Avenue. Here's the old, the Armstrong Hotel. Here's the old telephone exchange building.
Courthouse.
Yes, the old courthouse, right? Yeah.
So if this is 50.
And then here's one a little further south. Here's the field house, College Avenue. Terry Lake up here. Gives you an interesting view of the town and what was there at that time. By that time you had the tower. And then of course the other thing that Avery did was he laid out the other streets very wide too. Many of them 140 feet wide. This mountain. And it was named because it was the street that went toward the mountain. There was even one map I found that called it Mountain View Avenue. Over time, they did put in the grassy medians. Those were not in the original plan. It was just, in fact, he put instructions in the 1874 newspaper that if you were going to plant trees in your yard along any of the city streets, he gave very specific directions on from the center line of the street how many feet back onto your property to plant the trees. And he and some other people went up into the foothills and actually brought down trees for people to plant. Problem with wide streets, 1913 in December and 1914 in January, we had an unbelievable snowstorm, stopped the trolley dead in its tracks, on its tracks. And how did they clear the street? One shovelful at a time, no snowplows. And there's other pictures of this snowstorm that you can see where they, even on College Avenue, where they shoveled, you could see the shovel cuts in the snowbanks. Another problem with wide streets in the early days, dust. So once we had a water system after 1883, this is down at, here's Jefferson and Linden, then you could dampen down the street, hold down the dust. Today that's that park where the Union Pacific Park. Here again is that intersection with Mr. Stover's drugstore on the corner as a one-story building. His plan, besides the names of people, was that basically east-west streets, except for Old Town, would be named for trees and bushes. School kids, even second graders can figure that out because we talk about, is it here we go around the mulberry tree or here we go around the mulberry bush? And of course they say bush, so say, okay, so it's trees and bushes. But this is looking southwest toward the foothills on Linden, and here's the, for years it was called the Linden Hotel. It actually is the Loomis and Andrews block because they're the ones that built it. I'm sure these kids were just wandering around and saw somebody with a camera and said, take our picture, take our picture. And so you got these 5 kids and their dog in the middle of Linden Street getting their picture taken. Trees and bushes, so Linden, and then the old City Hall and Firehouse are on Walnut Street, another tree. And another advantage of wide streets is great for parades. I think this was like an Elks convention parade sometime in the late 1800s. And in 1914, they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the founding of the fort. 1914 was the semi-centennial of the town. So here's a part of the semi-centennial parade on Linden Street. And there's quite a gathering. This is Mason Street. and this is West Oak Street. And back behind in the trees there would be the courthouse. 1907, 1908, for a couple of years they had what was called Lamb Days. And they built these big barbecue racks on the courthouse lawn, and they gave away food. And they literally had thousands of people that would come for Lamb Days. Yeah, we were the lamb feeding capital of the world. Then about 1909, 1910, the lamb market became depressed and they stopped it. But it was quite an event for a few years. And then, of course, what came later? Center Street parking. For at least half a century, it had to share the middle of the street with the streetcar. And sometimes somebody would park their car a little too far over, and the driver's side front fender would be kind of hanging over the trolley tracks, and the motorman would get out, put the car in neutral, push it back, put it back in gear, and away they'd go. The days when in a small town, you didn't lock your car. So we've talked about Jefferson. That's the president's name for one of the streets. And then the trees and bushes, and then the people that founded the town. And one of the most famous ones was Joseph Mason. And Joe Mason had come here in about 1860. Actually, had done some ranching out near LaPorte, then came closer to town, started a farm. If Wood Street crossed the river, he was on the north side of the river. If you extended Wood Street across out there where the city facilities are, but he had been the man who ran the sutler store for the fort, and this was corner of Jefferson and Linden. And then it became the town's first store. Eventually, after 1868, the courthouse was up here. They held church services. The fraternal groups met up there. And so when they started the town, he was one of the founders of the town, one of the people who bought into the Larimer County Land Improvement Company. Joe Mason got a street named for him, the first street west of College. And eventually, what did his street become famous for? The thing that we know his street for is the train, which I was going to get here very early tonight to get set up. And guess what? I got caught by the train at Mulberry and Mason. So imagine that. But in 1877, the Colorado and Central Railroad came to town and said, we'd like to bring you a railroad. And the town was dying, and the town fathers said, fine, we'll give you a right-of-way down Mason Street forever. So they'll be there forever. So it's longer than we'll be here. Joe Mason didn't end up getting to stay around here very long. In early 1881, the newspaper said he was working with a vicious colt. It kicked him in the back of the head, smashed in his head, and he lingered for about 2 or 3 days. They couldn't do anything about it, and he died. And so he tragically left us, very, very early on in the history of the town. Another man who helped start the town was Benjamin T Whedbee, nicknamed Uncle Ben. And he had been the county treasurer. And once the board of trustees, the town council was appointed by the county commissioners in February of 1873, he was elected to chair the committee, so he became the town's first mayor. And he had a store down where the old grout building was. He was in that. And then he built another building, and then in the late 1870s moved his store to the southeast corner of College and Mountain. And that started the move from Old Town to New Town of the business center. So Jefferson, Linden, originally the center of downtown, and then eventually College and Mountain. And this was put in the 1890s. This was a horse watering trough in the middle of College and Mountain. And then when they put streetcars in, obviously they had to move it. And it now sits in front of the museum. Henry Clay Peterson, who was here, he was a gunsmith with the fort. He was a civilian gunsmith. He and Auntie Stone had partnerships in the first brick kiln, the mill. He did a lot of other things. He actually helped build Auntie Stone's cabin, first private home in Fort Collins on the fort site. So he got a street named for him because he was one of the people that founded the town. And this was his residence that was built down by the mill. The mill that you see over there is one that was built later, the Harmony Mill. But this was the first brick house built in Fort Collins, down on Lincoln Street, down by the mill. and torn down when the railroad came through in 1910. And then Alfred Howes, who was a judge, he raised the money in 1870 to build the first schoolhouse down on Riverside, except it wasn't called Riverside then. It probably was referred to as Riverside Road, or the road alongside the river or something. That's where the first schoolhouse was. And so he was part of the town and one of the owners, and so he got the second street west of College named for him, which I just noticed when I crossed it tonight is now two-way traffic, so be careful. And then Mason's coming that way too. And then William Stover, another one of the founders of the town. He was a businessman and eventually was a banker, and he built the first brick business building on the well, it would be the east corner of this is Jefferson this way and Linden this way, in 1874. And that was his mercantile company. And again, another thing that was torn down when the Union Pacific Railroad came through and put the tracks in down there in 1910. Andrew Cowan, another founder of the town. We don't know much about him, mainly because look when he died, 4 years after the town was founded. So we really don't know much about Cowan. He was a business person, we do know that. It's the eastmost of the people named streets. Okay, and then as you go out south on College, there were blocks that were platted, but they weren't divided into lots until a little bit later. And then they named the streets, and these were not streets that were named by Mr. Avery, but once you get south of Plum, then the next street is the one that comes out here, which is Elizabeth. And who is that named for? Here's one possibility. Elizabeth Aiken, early kindergarten teacher and one of the first women elected to the school board after women got the right to vote in Colorado in 1893. So she's one possibility, Elizabeth Mellinger Aiken. That's Aunt Lizzie in our family. So Elizabeth Stone, be a good possibility. Her niece, Elizabeth Keyes Stratton, another very important Elizabeth in the early town. There was about two other Elizabeth possibilities. So we don't know who Elizabeth Street is named for. Here's the Remington School, and guess how it got its name? Because it was originally called the Remington Street School when it was completed in 1879. Long gone. It was torn down in the late 1960s. So here you can see how the town grew, and then we had the first true addition to the city. Here's Whitcomb Street, and here's LaPorte Avenue, and here's Laurel, and here is the first addition to the city. It was platted in 1887, and it was called the Loomis Addition. And Abner Loomis and Melinda Maxwell were the people who platted that subdivision. And again, an early pioneer, had been a rancher above LaPorte and so on in his early days, and was eventually went into partnership in the Poudre Valley Bank. And Mr. Loomis, on the plat map, the streets that went north and south were Lincoln, Grant, and Washington, but they weren't streets, they were avenues. They are avenues. Well, once it was laid out, the city said, wait a minute, we have a Lincoln Street over here. So they changed it to Loomis, after Abner Loomis. And this was the ad that ran for the Loomis edition. Basically what it says down here is this house and full-size lot to be given away. So if you bought a lot in the Loomis edition, you got a raffle ticket. This was the house that was going to be raffled off. And in the spring of 1888, when they'd sold enough lots in that edition, they held a drawing down in the Opera House, and a man named George Philibrown from Nebraska won this house and full-size lot. And eventually he sold it to Billy Patterson. That's basically the house today, with quite an addition onto the back, because it's a small house. If you're going to give it away, you don't want to build a big house. The living room is just a little bit wider than those two windows in the front. So, but when you walk in the door, it has a beautiful, going up here, there's a beautiful carved wooden staircase, beautifully carved. But this was the house that was given away. And Billy Patterson, who was ran a livery stable here, he had come west with William Cody. They drove wagons on the Santa Fe Trail, and then they parted company, and Billy Patterson, his name actually was Arthur, but he was called Billy, came to Fort Collins, and the other Billy went to work for the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was being built, and almost single-handedly wiped out the herd of American Bison. And so he got the nickname you well know, Bison William. Now I tell that to elementary kids and they kind of look at me like, what? I said, how about Buffalo Bill? Oh yeah. Though actually a lot of the kids anymore don't know Buffalo Bill, unfortunately. Here's a map of the town in 1884. Actually, it's more of a sketch of the town with the various buildings drawn in. Here's the college, and here's a lake with trees around it. Just to the east of College, and there's the bed of that lake after it was drained. The old Fort Collins High School sits on lake. And that's why we have a Lake Street over there. Then out northwest of town, you have a ridge that's called Taft Hill. Walter Taft in 1876 built this part of the house out there. Later on added this part, 2 parts in the back. And so the road that came by there became known as Taft Hill Road.
And where was that?
If you're going north on Taft, just before you go down the hill to the river, that's where the house is. This is what Linden Street looked like back in the, I guess those cars are what, early 70s? In 1983, a visionary man, Gene Mitchell, had an idea, said let's dig up Linden Street and create something like the Boulder Mall. He was going to actually want to do 2 blocks, but he was only able to get enough partners in that, buildings and people and so on, to do 1 block. So he created the Old Town Plaza. And I think, that's a wonderful thing for downtown and really revived the downtown. Big center for tourism and for events and just lots of different things. Okay, you ready for the test? Okay, the only place in town where 4 different streets come together at one point. Not Willow and Cherry, no, because Willow, Cherry, and College. Jefferson, Riverside, Mountain, Lincoln. That's our 4 corners. Well, you did so well on that. Let's try this one. Tulane and Purdue. What's this subdivision called? South College Heights. Why is it important? Anybody know? Because it was the first modern addition to the city, the first modern suburb. When the town started to grow after World War II, this was platted. The plat was filed on this on the August 13th, 1954, and then really developed starting around 1960. Okay, how about Ellis and Edwards? What's the subdivision? University Acres, wonderful, thank you. This one was platted in 1957. How about Cheyenne and Mohawk? Indian Hills, okay? And this was in October of 1958. So the town, 1950s was really the beginning of the rapid growth of the town. Okay, how about Meadowlark and Avocet? Now there's kind of a clue there. Meadowlark, yeah, Meadowlark subdivision with all the bird names, Red Wing and all those. Okay, now here's a stumper. Skimmerhorn, Zent, and Pasquinel. Yeah, but it's not called Centennial Subdivision, surprisingly. Where Quail Hollow. No, Quail Hollow. Yeah, this is over in Quail Hollow. But these are all names from Missioner Centennial. In fact, there's even a Missioner Street over there and a Centennial Street. Okay, here's one that'll stump pretty much all of you. Is that a traffic circle? My wife for years said, there used to be a traffic circle. I want you to find me a picture of it. It only took me about 15 years. This is Highway 14 going east, and this is US 87. Which is now I-25, the old Washington Highway. And they had a traffic circle. And somebody told me, don't call that a roundabout. It's a traffic circle.